Okay, Shechianu v'kimanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. I had a tremendous excitement starting this man. I want to tell you that the first couple of days in the Beis Medrash has been very, very special. The Avirah has been really, really special, and I don't know if I've ever said this at the beginning of this man, but I have a tremendous excitement to be learning with you. And the ultimate of all smicha limudim, and that's the limud of Isser v'Heter. And how we're going to go about learning Isser v'Heter, Mirza Hashem, I will discuss after the formal shir, because I just want to really just jump in, Bezras Hashem, and start Hilchos Basar B'Chalav with the momentum that we've started with. The Mirza Hashem, in today's shir, what we're going to do is, it's going to be a Hakdama shir, because what I'm going to do with you is discuss many different topics, but it's going to topics within Isser v'Heter, particularly Basar B'Chalav and Taruvas, but it will all be based on the opening lines of the Tur. And what we're going to do is discuss and contrast the relationship between Machalas Asuros in general and Basar B'Chalav. That's going to be our focus in Mirza Hashem for most of this afternoon. And that will take us to some details of the halachos of Bishul as well, particularly how to define Bishul Basar B'Chalav. So if you will, those are the two topics for today. An analysis that begins with the opening words of the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Pei Zayin, which will give us the contrast between Basar B'Chalav and Shari Surim. We will use that as that conceptual framework also as a quote-unquote excuse to introduce ourselves to many concepts that make Isser v'Heter difficult. I remember the first time I was learning Basar B'Chalav, so we weren't, Rav David Gottlieb and I were Chavrustas, we didn't go to Shir except for Rabbi Genak Shlita's amazing Chabura, which I'm going to make reference to often, but it met every once in a while. And so we didn't have a framework that we were working off of, and I remember just being totally confused by the many concepts that we were encountering. So here, I'm going to try to do is, along the way in this introduction, also introduce some of the concepts for those of us who already know Nashim, Nezik, and Cold. Still, Isser v'Heter concepts might be a little bit new. So let's begin. The Tur in Siman Pei Zayin, Sif Aleph writes its follows. Let's read the holy words together. Isser Basar B'Chalav, Ksiv, it's written 3 times in the Torah. Mishpatim Kisisa in Parshas Re'eh, Lo Savashol Gedi B'Chalev Imo, V'ner B'Sholosh Pam Torah, Echad L'Isser Bishul, Echad L'Isser Achila, Ve'echad L'Isser Hana. So the Torah tells us nowhere that it's prohibited to eat Basar B'Chalav. It says Lo Savashol 3 times, but Chazal have a tradition. We have the Gemara on the bottom of Kuf Yud Gimel in your booklet over there, where the Gemara says that each one of those times that's written is to tell us a different Isser, once for Bishul, once for Achila, once for Ana. V'haitzi Isser Achila b'Lashon Bishul, loymar she'ein aser min ha'Torah ela derech Bishul. Avol midrabanan aser b'chol inyan. So here Chazal address the obvious question. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kaviyachol's kavana was that it should be prohibited to eat Basar B'Chalav, so why did he formulate it as Bishul? Should say once Bishul, once Achila. So here the Tur answers the question by explaining a fundamental din, which is going to bring us to the first difference between Basar B'Chalav and Nevela. In last week's parsha, we had that the Torah said Lo Yisaychlu Kol Nevela right before Chamishi, and the Aliyah concluded Lo Savashol Gedi B'Chalev Imo. So when it comes to the Isser Basar B'Chalav, clearly it connotates as well in Isser Achila according to Chazal, yet nevertheless, the Torah, when it came to the Isser of Nevela. By the way, what is Nevela? So Nevela is an animal that hasn't been slaughtered properly. Why is it that we call animal, when you say an animal that you can't eat the meat, let's say you buy from someone bought something from a store that didn't have a good kashrus, what will most people say? The meat is treif. Is the meat really treif? What should they probably say? The meat is nevela. That's wrong. You shouldn't say the meat is treif. So there's going to be some idealistic guy out there that's going to say the meat is nevela. He's not going to say treif. Where did this mistake come from? So I have a theory, a very simple theory. I didn't see this in writing, but my simple theory is as follows: that once upon a time in the shtetl, so there all the meat that was slaughtered, that was available to the Jews, came from a Jewish butcher, came from a shochet. The shochet generally knew how to shecht. He was appointed by the Rav. So generally what he shechted was not nevela. But what you couldn't eat in the shtetl was usually something that the shochet checked. And it turned out it was a treifa. It was a treifa. So once upon a time in the shtetl, most of the meat that you couldn't eat was treif. And somehow that carried over to even societies where the meat was actually really nevela, hence people use the expression treif, but we should probably use the expression nevela. Okay, so we have lo sochel kol nevela, that you're not allowed to eat the treif, the quote-unquote treif meat, but when it comes to basar b'chalav, there it's written b'lashon bishul. So it comes along the Torah, and the Torah tells us, leaving aside the question that hopefully we'll get to by the end of Shir today, that the Torah uses bishul to describe achila, which is strange, but it's more than that, because the word bishul is going to define the iser achila and the iser hana. Dahainu, what does that mean? That means that if you have meat and milk that were mixed, and there's taste of meat and milk inside of them, nevertheless, if it was not done through bishul, it's not going to be considered basar b'chalav d'oraisa. In other words, the bishul is a t'nai for it to be a cheftza of basar b'chalav. So when it comes to nevela, all of that question doesn't exist. When it comes to nevela, so there, the Torah never mentioned the word bishul. How does this play out halacha l'maisa as a nafkamina? So the second nafkamina we're going to have between nevela and basar b'chalav, what's the first nafkamina? First nafkamina is that when it comes to nevela, of course, there's no iser to cook nevela. There's no iser hana of nevela. In fact, we had in last week's parsha that you should give it to the goy asher b'sharecha. But when it comes to basar b'chalav, there's going to be iser hana. That's nafkamina number one. Nafkamina number two is going to be a very, very fascinating nafkamina. And that is the issue of kavush. If the basar b'chalav is soaked, so then in such a case it can't be an Isser D'Oraisa. Let us give an example. Let's say you have a case in which milk and meat have been soaking for more than 24 hours. So Chazal tell us, kavish is kimavushal. It's considered as if it's mavushal. All this what I'm spelling out is in the Beis Yosef. That if kavish is considered mavushal, it's considered cooked. What does that mean? That means the following. That means if you soak nevela, let's move over to nevela for a moment. If you soak a piece of meat that wasn't slaughtered properly, which you can't eat minat Torah, you soak it with another piece of meat, and the tam of nevela goes in to that second piece of meat, because kavush is kamavushal, bishul is a transference of tam, it transfers taste. So then in such a case, that piece of meat, if it has tam, and we follow the rule, tam ki'ikar is minat Torah, so then in such a case, the piece of meat will be aser to eat minat Torah. However, if we're talking about basar b'chalav, so then even though 100% it has tam, haTorah hi'ida, through the Gemara in Chulin of kavush kimavushal, that the Gemara tells us that there is going to be tam. But nevertheless, if that tam wasn't contracted, it wasn't created through the process of bishul, it's only going to be an Isser D'Rabbanan. So we see that the Torah's description of lo sevashel already has implication, even though it does connotate achila, but it's going to define the Isser Achila. And that's what the Torah is concluding over there. V'hotzi Isser Achila, Sifalth. V'hotzi Isser Achila b'lashon bishul, lo mer shein asim eTorah derech bishul, avol midrabanan asim b'chol inyan. So what he's referring to over here is the din of kavush kimavushal. There's another nafkamina that's a very important nafkamina, and that's based on a fascinating Rambam. The Rambam writes in Perek Yud Aleph in Hilchos Machalas Asuros. The next few nafkaminas I'm going to be quoting from, you could find in your Pri Megadim. So you might want to take a look at the Psicha. In my edition, it's prior to, right before Hilchos Basar B'chalav. So the Pri Megadim has a beautiful hakdama. When you have some time, if you're not behind in where we're up to in the Shulchan Aruch Shach Taz, I highly encourage you to go through the Pri Megadim's Psicha. It's absolutely beautiful. Every single Psicha that the Pri Megadim does is so fundamental. So the Pri Megadim points out that the Rambam makes another diuk in the Lashon Hakra, that the Torah never formulates the Isser B'Lashon Achila, even though Chazal tell us that Bishul includes Achila, that will have an afkamina of Shelo Kederech Achilasa. The Rambam writes, the Kol Isurin Ein Lokin El Derech Achila, Chutz Mi Basa B'Chal V'Klaya Kerem, Shim Iriv Dover Mar B'Socho Chayiv. We're going to discuss in Yirtzeh Hashem this case in detail in the right time, but now for our purposes, the Torah, when it comes to both Basa B'Chalav as well as by Klaya Kerem, doesn't formulate the Isser with the word achila, and since the Torah doesn't use the word achila, that tells us that even if you have ana shelo kederech achila, the example that the Rambam gives is if there is a lot of bitter stuff that's in the basar b'chalav, it doesn't taste good, so that eating is going to be an eating shelo kederech achila. Normally, if you have hana shelo kederech achila, so shelo kederech hanas, and you probably are familiar with from other sugyas that the halacha is that you don't get malchus. Nevertheless, we have our third nafkamina between Basar B'Chalav and Shari Surim. When it comes to Basar B'Chalav, as well as Klaya Kerem, those are the two exceptions the Rambam describes. There you're going to be Chayiv even Shelo Kederech Achilas. So Rabbosa, we are making a big deal about, this is one of my favorite topics, is that how the Torah formulates Bishul Basar B'Chalav has so much implication in terms of understanding the details of the halachas. And we're going from halachos mefurashos, and eventually it's not only going to be halachos mefurashos, they're going to be nafkaminas, but it's going to introduce us to some of the basic concepts of Isser v'Heter, as well as some fascinating, even lamdasha diyunim as well, that are going to be the underpinnings of everything that, a lot of what we're going to be discussing as the year goes on. So far, three nafkaminas. Number one, hana. Number two, the din of the requisite of bishul by Basar B'Chalav, in contrast to kavush, would be chayiv if you hold tam ki ikar when it comes to shari surim. Number three is shelo kederech hanasa. Number four is the Pri Megadim points out in the second paragraph. I was quoting from the Pri Megadim in the fourth paragraph of my edition. The next nafkamina is a very, very important nafkamina, not so much only for the nafkamina itself, but to introduce you to a concept that you are eventually going to run into, and is probably the most fundamental concept that exists in all of Basar B'Chalav Taruvas. And that is the Gemara's Chidush on Daf Kuf Ches in Maseches Chulin, and that is Chaticha Nasis Nevela. We're going to assume the concepts Chaticha Nasis Nevela and Efshar L'Sochto are synonymous. It's a big discussion in the Rishonim, but to make things straightforward, we're going to right now assume that they are the same concept, and b'siyata d'shmaya we will explain it so that when you come across it, Mirza Hashem, that will be clear, as well as to give our fourth nafkamina. Chaticha nasas nevela means the following. If you have, this is a Mishnah on Kuf Ches and Chulin. The Mishnah says if you have a tipas chalav that falls onto a piece of meat, the halacha is if that piece of meat falls into another pot of meat, so then we could, if you will, ask the following question. If we would be discussing in Achronisha terminology, but this is the Gemara itself, and there's a halacha psuka, but if in Achronisha terminology, we would call it as a chakira. The question would be, how do you measure the Isser? Do you measure the Isser just in terms of the amount of meat and milk that gives off its taste into the other pieces of meat? Or do we say, and this is the Chiddush of Chaticha Nas Nevela, we don't do that, but rather we measure the Isser by the entire piece of meat. That when you have a piece of meat that absorbs Basar B'Chalav and it becomes Basar B'Chalav, then you don't measure based on the amount of Basar B'Chalav that goes into the other pieces of meat, but rather you're Mishar Shishim. Again, we'll explain all that down the line, but we estimate how we came to Shishim and so on. We estimate in order to make the entire Taruvas kosher, there has to be 60 times, not the Tam Basar B'Chalav, there has to be 60 times that Chaticha of Isser. How and why, those details in Mirza Hashem we're going to get to later on. But that's the magic of Chaticha Nasas Nevela. That's the magic of Chaticha Nas Nevela. What is the svara of Chaticha Nas Nevela? So the Ran writes, and the Pri Megadim alludes to this in Sifkat and Beis. The Ran writes in the 8th parak of Chulin, the Ran writes as follows. The Ran says, the only time Chaticha Nas Nevela makes sense is with the topic of basar b'chalav. When it comes to basar b'chalav, there you have heter veheter that come together and create isur. Tosas writes this as well in a few places in Chulin. You have heter of basar, heter of chalav, and they come together and then they create a chefza of isur. So now what happens is, it's not just simply that you have a little bit of tam chalav and you have a little bit of tam basar and you can't eat that tam together, but rather the Torah told us that when you cook them together, so then the basar itself becomes a chefza shel isur. Then chaticha nasis nevela. In a moment I will show you that we don't have that approach when it comes to nevela. And the Ran writes, it doesn't make sense to say chaticha nasas nevela when it comes to other isurim. And we're going to give the Ran's example, and then we're going to go to our next nafkamina. We're going to be going to our, I think, fifth nafkamina between basar b'chalav and shar isurim. The Ran says, let's say you had liquefied chalev that's liquefied. Also, machalas asuras. Generally, when we speak about a piece of meat that has become liquefied, we talk about chalev because chalev is more likely to be turned into liquid than a piece of meat. So if you have chalev, in theory, you could nowadays with chemicals you could probably do it to nevela as well. But the classic example the Rishonim deal with is chalev. So let's say you have chalev and you liquefy it and it falls into a piece of meat. So then in such a case, there's a big machlokes Rishonim whether we say chaticha nasas nevela by shar isurim. That's going to be one of the most intense simanim, Mirz Hashem, Siman Sadi Beis. Look forward to it. It's going to be geshmak, but it's intense. So in Siman Sadi Beis, we're going to have a big discussion starting with the Rishonim all the way through the Mechaber Ramah, then a question of what the Ramah's Achra is, and then Shachs, and then Mirz Hashem will be Lebedik. So that's a big question in regards to whether we say Chaticha Nas Nevela as well. What does that mean? How do you measure now when that piece of meat falls into the entire pot? Do you measure just Keneged the Chalev that fell into that Chaticha, or do you measure against the entire Chaticha? Says the Ran, what's the logic? There's no isur in the host meat. The only isur is the chalev. Says the Ran, my kasha is so strong that it must be that's Gzera midrabanan. Midrabanan they asered chatich nas nevel by shar isurin atu basar b'chalav. And actually that's going to come out. Lahalacha, there are many instances we will be machmir in chatich nas nevel by shar isurin, but don't be confused. Says the Ran. The Ran says it makes sense to say chatir nas nevela when you have two things of heter that come together to create a chefza shel isur. So then in such a case, then we're going to say chatir nas nevela, and then that's the chidush akrav lo savashol gedi b'chalevi mo that's telling us that the chaticha becomes a chefza of isur and your mashar keneged the entire chaticha. However, pi dinei Torah, why in the world are you going to say that you're going to measure keneged the host chaticha? The isser that's here is only chalev. The meat itself that absorbed the chalev is heter gamur. It just happens to be it's a host. Just because it's a host, why is it going to be aser? It's a good kasha. It makes sense when it comes to basar b'chalav because now the meat itself becomes a chefza of isser. So this is nafkamina number. Who's keeping track? What number we're up to? This is not, thank you, this is nafkamina number 4 between basar b'chalav and shar isurim, and it's, again, as we're pointing out, it's starting from the psukim of last week's parsha, that when it comes to nevela, there's an isra achila. The word bishul means so much more than just stam, that it's usher to cook, or stam that for some reason the Torah decided to answer it 3 times, b'lashon bishul. There's a lot more that's happening. It's telling us many other dinim that we're b'siyata d'shmai coming to learn, as we saw from the Tur, and as we see the Pri Megadim, Mirz Hashem, developing. The Pri Megadim takes this idea further in regards to nafkamina number 5, and that is the question of tam ki'ikar. So, you've probably come across when you learn Pesachim, the sugyas of tam ki'ikar. The concept of tam ki'ikar is as follows, that if you have a solid item, or even a liquid, that the majority of it is heter gomor, but there was taste of iser that was given off into the taruvas. One type of example would be, let's say you cooked nevela inside a soup, you took out the nevela, there's no more nevela in the soup, but the soup now has tam nevela. So in such a case, is that asr min haTorah to eat the soup? So here there's a sugim psachim mem gimel mem dal mem hey, and of course you have it in kol habasar as well, where you have a discussion of tam kicker. It just came up in the Daf Yomi also, in the Samachs and Avodah Zarah. You have a discussion whether tam is kicker. Again, there are many sub-machlokios over here within tam kicker, which we'll get to in Mirz Hashem when we do Taruvas. But the Talmudic question, leaving aside the Rishon and the medieval question, the Talmudic question is, do you say tam kicker is aser min haTorah at all? There was a tradition in the Gemara that was aser, but is it aser min haTorah or is it aser midrabanan? That's a long sugya in Psachim. And it's machlokes rishonim how we paskin, and we will get to that in Hilchos Taruvos. And then there are other questions like how much what is the sheer malkos if you hold tam kickers daraisa? Even if this tam kickers daraisa, how much do you have to eat in order to get malchus? Maybe tam kicker could be awesome in Torah, but doesn't necessarily mean that there's a chi of malchus. V'chule, v'chule, v'chule. But that's already the medieval discussion. What's the Talmudic discussion? So, and how are we machriya in that Talmudic discussion? So, interestingly, the Gemara there says, well, maybe tam kicker is daraisa, and I'll learn from basar b'chalav. The Gemara in Pesachim says that we see tam kickers min Torah. Dahainu lo sevashol gedi b'chalevimo. The connotation is that if you have meat that has tam chalav, it's going to become aser. So you see tam kickers min Torah. So the Gemara says, no, that's different. When it comes to basar b'chalav is unique. Basar b'chalav is unique because even if you soak them together, even when there is tam, so then it's still not going to be aser min Torah. It's dafka derech bishul. That's a theme that we already discussed previously. So you can't learn from basar b'chalav. So basar b'chalav, it's going to be doraisa. When it comes to shari surim, so then in such a case, there's a question whether we extend basar b'chalav to shari surim or not. Machlokes amoraim, machlokes rishonim, how we paskin v'chulei. Says the Pri Megadim, the shita that holds here. You know what? Let's read it inside. This way, doesn't have to be Torah Shabbal Peh. Take a look at Oz Gimel in the Pri Megadim. Tam ki'ikar b'basar b'chalav l'kulei alma havim min haTorah. Ubeshari surim yesh poskim delo aser ela midrabanan. So he says there are poskim midrabanan, and then he goes on to give a nafkamina, even if you hold tam ki'ikar is going to be doraisa by shari surim. Leaving aside the more complicated nafkamina, there's a clear understanding of why basar b'chalav is going to be different by shari surim. When it comes to basar b'chalav, there the Torah went out of its way to say if you cook the milk with the meat, then the halacha is that you can't eat the meat. So obviously there you're going to say tam kicker. However, when it comes to nevela, show me a pasuk that says tam kicker. What does the pasuk say in last week's parsha? Lo sochlu nevela. Don't eat nevela. There's no connotation of tam kicker. Memela, so that is going to be behind the shitas hamoraim, the shitas harishonim that paskin that there's going to be a difference between tam kicker. Again, have we plumbed the depths of tam kicker? Absolutely not. But it's connected to the introduction as well of Simin Pei Zayin, and that is nafkamina number 5. Okay, that is our 5th nafkamina. Nafkamina number 6 is a beferish halacha in Taruvas. If you can, please don't only bring a basar b'chalav to share, but please bring as well Hilchos Taruvos as well, if you have the 2 different volumes. In Simin Kuf Aleph Sif Beis, you could open up either the Tur or the Shulchan Aruch. We have a very important application to that which we just discussed. And that is the following. The Mechaber writes about Chaticha Real Eskabitz. I told you along the way, one of the bonuses, we're going to be introducing ourselves to the newer concepts that you don't see in Nashim and Nezikin. So one of the important concepts in Basar B'chalav Taruvos in regards to bittul is Chaticha Ruya Liskabed. We know the Torah tells us this. You touched on in Sanhedrin and in Bava Kama the din of Achrei Rabim Lahatos, that the rule that you follow Rov, and of course a fascinating discussion in the Rishonim how that rule applies first when it comes to Dayanim and somehow is extended to the rules of Rov in general when it comes to bittul. Let's say you have 2 pieces of meat, which is a lot of hilchos taruvas. 2 pieces of meat are kosher and 1 is not kosher. If they're mixed together, so then the halacha is that the taruvas is mutter. Of course, then there's a fascinating discussion that the Rosh has in the 7th parak of Chulin. What does that mean? It's mutter. Does that mean you could eat all 3 pieces? Does it mean you could eat them you could only eat 2 or 3. And if you eat 3, could you eat all 3 of them together? Wow. Halacha defies reality. I know for a fact that there was a piece of treif, but I could eat the treif. Why? Just because, how does that work? Okay, Mirza Hashem in the right time. That's going to be in Hilchos Taruz. Or the halacha would be, that's the Shita of the Rosh. The Shita of the Rashba is you could eat them, but you can't eat them all together. You could eat them zeh achar zeh. You could be tola that this is the one of heter. But those details, let's put on the side. That's the rule of bittul. There are Hilchos Taruvos in Simonim, Kuf Aleph, Kuf Beis, and Kuf Gimel are all about examples where the rules of Rov technically exist. You have 2 heter and you have 1 iser, but the rule of bittul is undermined by the fact that the iser stands out. So one example is beria. That beria is chashuv and therefore not batul. It was also referred to sometimes in the Mishnayos as a davar chashuv. Another example of that is chaticha ruya skabe. The halacha is that if you have 2 pieces of kosher meat, 1 piece of non-kosher meat, that they're normally batul, but if we're talking about fancy pieces of meat, so since it's chashuv, it's not batul, it defies bittul. Now I have a fascinating shayla for you, Rabbi Osei. This is all the introduction to nafkamina number 6, between basar b'chalav and shari surim. Now I have a fascinating shayla for you. What happens if I have chaylev, liquefied chaylev again, and it falls onto a chaticha? And that chaticha is now mixed up with 2 other kosher chatichas. And that chaticha is a chaticha ru'i l'skabed. On the one hand, the chaylev is not ru'i l'skabed. On the other hand, its host is ru'i l'skabed. Let's not pass on that shayla yet. Let's now ask another shayla. What happens if you have milk that fell onto a chaticha ru'i l'skabed? On the one hand, the milk is not ru'i l'skabed. On the other hand, the chaticha is. So comes along the Mechaber, and the Mechaber, you should be able to answer this question. It's not Bechina time, so I won't ask you to answer it. Anybody want to speculate? What would the answer be? Yeah? Beautiful. Azay state the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber in Siman Kuf Aleph Sif Beis, says the Mechaber, Ein lo din chaticha liskabed elam kain. But what the Mechaber is going to do is not only give us an interesting halacha, he's also going to give us a very important terminology, which eventually, of course, for us, eventually is going to get back to Torah's Brisk and the Masorah from Reb Chaim through Reb Soloveitchik Zatzal. But the Mechaber already basically said one of Reb Soloveitchik's famous expressions that he used. I'm not going to reveal the context yet in the Shach and Taz where he was discussing it, but again, we're setting up, Emir Tzashem, how this develops. It says the Mechaber, Ein la din chaticha ru'i l'skabed elim kein isura machmas atzma kegon nevela ubasa b'chalav. Aval im nesra machmas she kibla tam me'iser v'lo haya b'shishin levato afilu mi shesover chaticha atzma natz nevela ein la din chaticha ru'i l'skabed. If you have a case in which the chaylev falls into a chaticha, the term that the poskim use is that's called an iser balua, excuse me. The iser was balua into the chaticha. So is the iser ru'ya l'skabed? The answer is no. The iser is not ru'ya l'skabed. Since the iser is not ru'ya l'skabed, so then it's true. You have a chaticha what's aser, and that chaticha happens to be ru'ya l'skabed, but the iser is not ru'ya l'skabed. So the mele of the iser is going to be batal. The iser is batal to the general taruvis. However, if we're talking about basar b'chalav, what's the terminology here that the Mechaber uses? An isura machmas atzma. The isur itself, the chaticha itself, becomes a chefetz of isur. That's the magic, if you will, of lo savashel gediva chalevi mo. The magic of lo savashel gediva chalevi mo is that if you have a bishul basar b'chalav, so then in such a case the whole chefetza becomes a chefetz basar b'chalav. Then in such a case, then chaticha ru'ya l'skabed is going to be a problem. So that is nafkamina number 6. So let's just review what we have up until now. Number 1, if I go a little bit out of order, you could correct me so this way the notes don't become confusing. Number 1 is the Torah itself. The Torah says that the Isser nevela by is an Isra Achila, in contrast to Lo Savashal Chazal Darshan Echad Isra Achila, Echad Isra Anav, Echad Isra Bishul Mashma. That's the first distinction. Number two is that we saw that the Torah already told us in the opening of Siman Pei Zayin is that the Chefza of Isra Basar B'chalav is only created through Bishul. So if you have Bishul, so then you will have Basar B'chalav. Even though Kavush gives off Tam, you can have Tam. But if the tam wasn't created via bishul, so then in such a case, it's not going to be basar b'chalav. Will it happen isur of d'oraisa through tam when it comes to nevela? If you assume tam kicker, the answer is yes. Which brings us to tam kicker. We did tam kicker maybe a little bit later on, but now that I mentioned tam kicker, so tam kicker is another nafkamina. It's pasha the tam kicker when it comes to basar b'chalav. Why? Because of this idea that the Torah asered the tam kicker. That's goof what the Torah tells you. By nevela, that's an open question. Is there a source in the Torah? So maybe by Nazir, because the rule of Mishras, that if you soak bread in wine, so then you see that the Mishras is also going to be Asar. So maybe you could apply it to Kol Torah Kula. Can you apply it? Can you apply it? That's going to be the Machlokas. But there's going to be no Machlokas, says the Pri Megadim, when it comes to Tam Ki'ikr. The third nafkamina that we had given, I'm doing a little bit out of order, but when we started, it was the third nafkamina we had given is that the Rambam says there is a stringency that emerges from the fact that the Torah never asered achila when it comes to basar b'chalav, and that tells us that even if it's shelo kederech achilasan, you're going to be chayiv. And this is going to be important later on in halacha l'maisa, and that is that if ira davar mar, if you mix something bitter inside the basar b'chalav, so a normal person would not eat it, but for some reason a person eats it, nevertheless you're going to still get malchus for basar b'chalav because the Torah didn't formulate it b'lashon isra achila. Of course, the halacha would not be that way when it comes to nevela. With that, we could now understand both the din of chaticha rui l'skabed that we were introduced to, as well as the din of chaticha nas nevela. The din of chaticha rui l'skabed we saw is mafurish in the Tur. The Tur says that the halacha is that when it comes to chaticha rui l'skabed, there basar b'chalav is for sure it's not going to be batal if you have milk that was cooked with a chaticha rui l'skabed. Yet, if we contrast it to shari surim, that if you have, let's say you had kosher meat that was cooked with chaylev and has tam chaylev inside, and then you took out and it was mixed with two other kosher chatichos, and you have tam chaylev, so tam chaylev is not going to be enough to aser. Or if you have a tipa that falls on top, obviously that might get involved with tam kicker and so on, but even better, if you have the tam that fall on top, the drip, the liquefied chaylev falls on top, so then in such a case, then you don't say chaticha rui l'skabed, even if the host happens to be a chaticha rui l'skabed, which sets up the Pri Megadim's point that the Ran really developed very, very clearly, and that is the notion that when it comes to chaticha nas nevela, this fascinating sugya that we're going to have a lot about, that you measure the isser by the chaticha and not by simply the tam of the isser itself, that makes sense when it comes to basar b'chalav, that the Torah asered that chaticha. So that chaticha becomes an isser machmas atzma. The whole chaticha becomes basar. When I say a whole chaticha, I mean everywhere the chalav reached. Everywhere that the chalav reaches in that chaticha, it's going to be aser. Not necessarily does that mean that when you cook that chaticha with something else, that it's going to go into the next piece of meat, both tam basar and tam chalav. But nevertheless, that chaticha now becomes aser. The entire chaticha now becomes aser, and therefore you have to be mishar keneged kol chaticha. Wherever the milk reaches in that piece of meat, even if when you cook that piece of meat with other pieces of meat, if there's less than shishim, it's going to be aser, even if the other piece of meat won't get the tam chalav. Why? At the end of the day, where's their basar b'chalav in the other piece of meat? That's the magic of chaticha nas nevela. The magic of lo savashal kadid b'chalev imo is telling us that the entire chaticha is going to become aser, and memela now that cheftza of basar could aser if there isn't shishim kenegdo, even if the other pieces of meat haven't gotten enough chalav. That's the magic of chaticha nas nevela. Does that magic apply to shari surim? There are shitas that hold that way. So Ran begins to scratch his head. How does that work? The answer is, says Ran, it's a din d'Rabbanan, because at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense that should apply by shari surim. When you have chaylev that fell onto a piece of meat, so then you should be mishar, not keneged the piece of meat. You have to be mishar, keneged the chaylev, and therefore the halacha would be that you mishar shishim only keneged the chaylev. Okay, yeah, I'm not done with the nafkaminas, but we've introduced a few concepts also along the way. Obviously, the goal was to do Pei Zayin, but I figured this is a geschmack way to start because we also have these concepts slowly. Yeah?
So Basar B'chalav mixed not in the Daf Shulo fashion, it's only Derabana.
Right.
But there is Tam Kek, so Tam is transferred though.
But still it's only Asim D'Rabbanan because Xeris HaKasav Lo Tzavashel. Correct. The Tam Ki Ikar has to be created through Bishul. Take a look at something fascinating, Rabbi Kiva Eger, Sifkat and Gimel, that's connected to your question. Well, we'll get there, Mirza Hashem. We're going to get to it in the next year. Anything else, Rabbosai? Clarification, questions? Moving ahead, plowing ahead. So let's now give a few more interesting, fascinating nafkaminas. I put in, I think made its way into a booklet. The Beis Meir is one of the great poskim. I was just by my Rebbe from Tarvadas, who amazingly, after all the many years, he's still very special in maintaining a kesher. My Rabbi Rev Reisman Shlita. So he was going on and on about what a fantastic. We were discussing Yardei Shaila where the Beis Meir is Mekel. There's a famous heter, Beis Meir Nat Barnat. So he said that Rav Pam was Mekel on that, and he asked him, but it's not the Mashmos of most of the poskim. Rav Pam said, "Do you realize who the Beis Meir was?" The Beis Meir was one of the great poskim of the 19th century. So here's a heter that's not so well known in the Beis Meir. I put in somewhere. I wrote some of these nafkaminas up. There's the same. Oh wow, it's getting a lot of quoting this week. Sir Miller Shlita quote from his article in the Teres Tzvi. So my article, Lahavdil, my article in the Teres Tzvi and Parshas Chukas was these nafkaminas between Basar B'chalav and Shari Surim. So you could take a look over there. So I noted over there, it's interesting that I didn't find it in other poskim, but the Beis Meir in Kuf Hey on the Taz, Sifkat and Dalid, writes the following. There is a discussion in Hilchos Taruvos. We know from Hilchos Shabbos that the general rule is Kli Rishon's Mavashal, Kli Sheni Einu Mavashal. How that plays out, Halach L'maisa, it's not always that Kli Sheni is Mavashal. We have Kalei Abishal, we discussed last year, Mechzik Mavashal, V'chulei V'chulei. But Pi Dine, the halacha is that mi'ikar the dina kli rishon zavashal kli sheni vashal. Anybody who teaches in seminary that a kli sheni is usher to cook in is going against the Torah. You can't say that. You can't say that you have to. That you could say that the rule is kli sheni and vashal, but there are many exceptions. But I don't know what's the exact lashon of the Vekas song. Oh, how does it go? There's no. That's I'm not. I don't like that. I don't like that. Nigga, I have to speak. Okay. So I don't know.
The original Moshe Yos didn't have it, but when A.D. Ron
there's no the lashon. There is no bishul in a kli shlishi. The connotation is that there's always bishul in a kli sheni. That diuk is wrong. I guess not Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So at the end of the day, you can't make diukim. But it's not true. It's a Farish Gemara that says a kli sheni is eino mavashal. So that's the rule. Kli sheni is eino mavashal. In most cases in Hilchos Shabbos, we're machmer a kli sheni. So that's what we learned last year. How and why. Nachzar l'inyanenu. The rule is Kli Rishon is Mavashal, Kli Sheni is Einu Mavashal. Interestingly, in Hilchos Taruvos, there is a big discussion, Simin Kuf Hey, that there are Rishonim who say that that's only regards to Hilchos Shabbos. Then when it comes to Hilchos, when it comes to Machalos Asuras, there's a new rule, and that is that Kli Sheni is Maflit Umavliya. The Mechaber quotes this in Simin Kuf Hey, Sifkat and Beis. So maybe they need to write a new song about Basar B'chalav. That may be there, that doesn't rhyme. No, it's no longer. But anyhow, so in Kufei Sif Beis, over here we've got the following. Here we say that a Kli Sheni is Maflit Umavliya. There are Shitas who hold Kli Sheni is Maflit Umavliya. What does that mean? That even though you can't have the strength of heat is not enough to actually halachically cook for Hilchos Shabbos, but it's enough to transfer taste. That's the discussion. We'll get there and we'll Mirza Hashem paskin on it based on our Rabbeim, but we're not now yet at the stage to be able to paskin the Shilas. Again, just getting the general background. Cliche is maflut umavliya. So says the Beis Meir something sharp. Says the Beis Meir, I think that you have to be machmer only when it comes to Shari Surim. Since there's a machlokes rishonim, where the cliche is maflut umavliya, and he says when it comes to Basar B'chalav, so there Basar B'chalav is only a Basar B'chalav if it's bishul. So you could only have bishul of Basar B'chalav in a Kli Rishon, because there's only bishul in a Kli Rishon. There's none in a Kli Sheni. So he says this whole question is a machlokas rishonim. So if you have only a question of shari surim, then we should be machmir, says the Beis Meir. That's mafla to mavliya. But if you're talking about basar v'chalav, so you're only talking about derabanan as it is anyhow. You will never have a doraisa because it's only a derabanan. So says the Beis Meir, therefore he holds you could be makil on the shaila mafla to mavliya when we're talking about basar v'chalav. Again, in your booklet, it's on the 3rd page. The pluksa de klisheni in maflut mavlik sheyatzeledus nirlini is daiti. Dilim basar b'chalav yesh l'smoch al mekim. Kim del kuli alma ein mevashel vein kana elos derabanan de derech bishul dafkas Torah. When it comes to the iser doraisa, it's only going to be derech bishul. So in a klisheni, it's not the derech to mevashel. Umederaban holchan achar ameka. B'shari sum shel doraisa. When it comes to shari sum, is one question only. What's the one question? Is there tam or there isn't tam? So the Rishonim would say, the Rashba says there is tam. Okay, you have to be choshesh for the Rashba. When it comes to Basar, Geshmak, no, it's the Geshmak of Beis Meir. It's not found in the Chachmas Adam. It's not found, and as I mentioned in the orientation, it's really striking. Reb Braunspiegel Zatzal and Yibadol Chaim, Rav Nevinsal, and Rav Miller, basically my three Rabbeim that over the years I asked a lot of questions to, all of them told me in different contexts, totally different contexts, that the Chachmas Adam is the Posek Achron in Yeridea. So it's interesting. The Chachmas Adam doesn't have a discussion about this, but there is this Beis Meir, and Rav Pam said, don't take the Beis Meir lightly, and don't take his kulas lightly as well. So it's something nice to have in your back pocket. That really starts from this Hakdama. Yeah?
What's the five derech b'shulo? Exactly.
So how we define derech b'shulo, Mirza Hashem, we will move on and eventually discuss that. But suffice to say that people generally don't cook in a kli sheni. That's not normal. The normal way to cook is in a kli rishon al gabe eish. What about kli rishon shelo al gabe eish yesh ladun? But that's the general rule. Probably the biggest chiddush of all of our list of nafkaminas over here. So I think we're up to the 9th. Nafkamina. The 8th. We're up to the 8th nafkamina? Beautiful. So we're up to the 8th nafkamina. Is Rabbi Akiva Eiger and a Chuvas also? This you will not find. And don't try this at home. You try this at home. I think I once mentioned it, and Rav Nevins, I didn't try it at home, but I once mentioned it to Rav Nevins, and he made a face about this, but it is fascinating. There is a Rabbi Akiva Eiger in the Chedushim on Kuf Chesam and Alf, as well as Rabbi Akiva Eiger raises this as a possibility in his Chuvas, and Siman Reish Zayin. I don't know if you could tell this to your wives. They'll be shocked. So where you use this, you decide on your own where you're going to use this. But Rabbi Akiva, fasten your seatbelts. Rabbi Akiva Eiger says that you're allowed, if you have a mixture of basar b'chalav, it was treif, you're allowed just to pour more meat inside of the mixture of basar b'chalav to be mevatel the yisur. For that matter, according to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, you'd be able to allow milk into meat as long as there's going to be shishim keneged the milk. It's kosher, right? But there is a famous rule in halacha called ein mevatlin isur lechatchila that we're going to do in tarus. That's a whole siman. You're not allowed to do mevatlin isur lechatchila. So if I have pork mixed with kosher meat, I'm not allowed to add more kosher meat because that's ein mevatlin isur lechatchila. So it says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that makes sense when we're talking about other isurim that are not defined by tam. So then I understand ein mevatlin isur lechatchila. You have an isur and you can't be mevatel. But says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, when it comes to basar b'chalav, what did the Torah aser? The Torah aser tam. That's what the Torah aser. Torah aser tam. So if there's no tam, then it's heter gamur. So you could be mefalpa within the rules of ein mevatlin isur lechatchila, but that's a dramatic example of how far the yisur of tam becomes. At the end of the day, says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, there's one question that you need to ask and one question only. And the question is there tam or is there no tam? So according to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, you'd be allowed, the simplest case of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, let me give you the simplest case. According to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, you'd be allowed to add a drop or two. The question is whether he really passed in this way, but according to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, in theory, you should be able to add a little bit of milk into the cholent, as long as there isn't going to be there's going to be less than shishim of meat, it'll be mutter. There's no problem. So this cannot be found in the poskim today. I think it's quite obvious why you don't see that, but that's how far that goes. So, but you would not be allowed, again, the best nafkamina is the pork, of dropping the pork into kosher meat. You would not be allowed to drop a little bit of pork in because of ein mevatlanis lechatchila. Maybe, says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, you could drop a couple of drops of milk in. Now, why would someone do it if he doesn't want the taste of milk? You can't have the taste of milk. So maybe there are, and then this gets involved with taruvas. What happens if it changes? It affects the texture, but it doesn't affect the tam. That we will get to also in the halachos of bittul. But for whatever reason, the person has this mishagas, so then in such a case, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that's the last nafkamina. The 10th nafkamina we're going to do as the first sugya that we have inside of the poskim on the daf on Siman Pei Zayin Sif Aleph. Now we're going to go through a couple of Rabbi Akiva Eigers and Pri Megadim. This is the last nafkamina, and that is Gidrei Bishul. So we have 9 nafkaminas. The 10th nafkamina is going to be, this is the 10th. We have 9th? Oh, sorry. Okay, so we have 8 nafkaminas, and the 9th, yes, correct, thank you. And the 9th is going to be this question. I have 2 more very exciting nafkaminas in the piece that I wrote up, but that already is more detailed, and they're involved with shachs and tazes, but we will do it b'meshech hashana. I think what will come out is then we'll have 11 nafkaminas at the end of the day, but I'm leaving 2 because they're much more involved in the shach, and Yisod from Rav Sol Leishik. We will get there, Mir Tzashem. So now, nafkamina number 9 is the sugya of ein bishul achar bishul. Take a look at Rabbi Akiva Eiger in Sif Katan Aleph towards the end. Rabbi Akiva Eiger writes, "V'kasav b'hagol Shari Dura." Shari Dura writes, "Shebesof hasefer, techaticha shenichbisha b'chalav, asla vashla." He writes as following: if you have a chaticha that has been soaked with meat, then it's aser to cook it. This is also that connected to the other Rabbi Akiva Eiger that I said to you, Uriel, which relates to your ha'ara. So Rabbosai, you have the case. You have meat and milk that have been soaked with each other. Ta'ad kan havi iser kavush midrabanan. Then the iser kavush is only midrabanan, right? Based on what we learned above. And what if you cook it now? Va'ata, if you cook it now, over al iser bishul doraisa, then you'll be over iser bishul doraisa. So now we have the following halacha, and that is, it makes sense, based on the nafkamina number 2 that we had, that said that kavush by basar b'chalav is only midrabanan. So here's the great chap that Uriel alluded to. If you had kavush of basar b'chalav, and then you cooked that same taruvas, then you'd be over iser doraisa, because up until now it was only derabanan. Everybody with me? Rabbi Akiva Eiger is clear? Beautiful. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger makes a beautiful deal. He says, mashma dim nisbashla b'chalav mutar lachzor levashla. But it's mashma that if it was already cooked, the basar and chalav was already cooked, so then in such a case, then it wouldn't be subject to lo savashla b'chalav mo. Why? That's what we learned last year. Ein bishul achar bishul. 2 points for Rabbi Akiva Eiger. You have something that was kavush basar b'chalav, and then you cook it, then it's nisur daraisa. That's the Shari Dura right. Says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, the mashmos of his words is that if you have basar b'chalav that's already been cooked, so then if you cook it again, then we say ein bishul achar bishul. That makes sense. That makes sense. Interestingly, the Sifsei Das does quote, that's the Pri Megadim, Sif Katan Beis. Of course, the Pri Megadim has a parish on the Shach and a parish on the Taz. The one on the Taz is called Mishpatzozav. The one on the Shach is called Sifsei Das, and they correspond to those appropriate letters. So at the end of Sif Katan Beis in the Sifsei Das, the Pri Megadim writes that there is an Eliyahu Zuta who holds not that way. And he says, just because we say Ein Bishul Achar Bishul B'Shabbos doesn't necessarily mean that we say Ein Bishul Achar Bishul when it comes to Basar B'Chalav. This is a minority opinion. Most Shitos do not hold this way. Most Shitos hold, like Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that the halacha would be that you wouldn't say Ein Bishul Achar Bishul. However, Rabbi Akiva Eiger's son came along and made a fascinating point that has become very popular, and Moreinu Rav Genak Shlita has pointed out that it's already, he was mechavein, Rav Shlomo Eiger was mechavein to a Rabbeinu Gershom in Chulin, and that's the next point, which is going to be another nafkamina between how you define basar b'chalav versus shari surim, and how it manifests in the rule of ein bishul achar bishul. Yes?
Just the chiluk between like solid foods and liquid foods that we have on Shabbos.
Very good. Yefemod. Rav Genak also raised that, and the Pri Megadim also discussed that. When we read it again, take a look at the Pri Megadim. He makes reference to it, but maybe we'll see it also in Rav Genak Shlita's Chidush as well. Comes along Reb Shlomo Eiger. Reb Shlomo Eiger says the following. He discusses the following case. Let's say you have meat that's been already cooked, and let's say you have milk that's already been cooked separately, and now you cook them. Do you say ein bishul achar bishul or not? Now, Rabbi, so let's discuss this shaila in Hilchos Shabbos. What would happen if? So this is already like the crease of shaila. Somebody's being over a few different Eastern at once. What happened if someone on Shabbos cooked basar that had already been cooked, chalav that had already been cooked, and he cooks them together? So what would the halacha be in Hilchos Shabbos? So leaving aside maybe davar lach of yesh bishul achar bishul b'davar lach, let's go with the Rishonim that say ein bishul achar bishul even b'davar lach, which is rov Rishonim. So paskin the shayla for me, what would you say? That he be pater for Shabbos, right? Because both of them have already been cooked. So it comes on Rav Shlomo Eiger that says that's true in Hilchos Shabbos, but for basar b'chalav he's going to be chayiv. And Rav Genak Shlita's masbir Gan Shoshanim Simin Mem. This is my first shir chabura that I heard from Rav Genak. So he said, and I photocopied, it's in your booklet. So Rav Genak said, but if the chidush of basar b'chalav is creating a chefza of basar b'chalav, that you have one thing of heter and one thing of heter, and now you've created a new chefza shalisser through bishul, so then eina chanami, both the chalav has been cooked and the basar has been cooked, but the chefza of basar b'chalav has not been created. So it could be, this is our edition, I can't promise exactly what Rav Genak said on the Hilchos Shabbos Shaila, but it's mistaber, that even though in Hilchos Shabbos the halacha would be that you not be chayiv, but in regards to basar b'chalav, you create a new chefza shel basar b'chalav, so therefore the halacha would be, that would be an iser daraisa of bishul basar b'chalav. And I mentioned to you that in Dibra Maschel b'chalav mavushal, Rabbeinu Gershom writes on Daf Kuf Chaf Beis, Kuf Chaf on the Beis, Kuf Ches on the Beis. It's an important Gemara over there. I highly encourage you. By the way, if you have a little time to dabble in the Gemaras, of course, I want you to be Amal and Torah Beis Yosef. But if you want to sink your teeth into a real important sugya for basar b'chalav, and you have time, let's say on Shabbos, and you want to be working on the Rishonim and so on, for those who are don't have the time in the morning to work on it, who are not working on the sugyas in the morning, so then I would encourage you to do that daf on Kuf Ches, the mission of Tipas Chalav and so on, and the Gemara Rashi Tosas and the Rishonim over there. Look, ideally, Smicha should be 10 years, and we should be spending 3 years on Isser v'Heter, but reality is a reality. So if you have some time, a little bit of time for the Gemara, I would encourage you to do that. And Rav Genak quotes this from Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal, this svara. And I also heard a similar svara. Rav Miller also said in his shiurim as well, said that svara. And Rav Miller pointed out that this could be connected, and we're going to connect this to another shaila as we go along. That Rav Miller pointed out, we have a fascinating chakira in how to spell the words basar b'chalav. How do you spell basar b'chalav? Is it basar b'chalav or basar v'chalav? So Rav Miller suggested that if what we're learning is, how do you put in the course catalog? Is it basar v'chalav or basar b'chalav? If you put it in the course catalog, Baruch Hashem, we don't even know what the course catalog looks like. But if you put in the course catalog as basar v'chalav, that the isser is basar and chalav coming together, not creating a new conglomerate, new chalos. So maybe there's room to say that there's room to say ein bishul achar bishul. But what are we being mechadesh today? That it becomes an iser machmas atzma, it becomes a new chefza shel iser. And what's the right way to spell it? The right way to spell it is basar bichalav. So if that's the right way to say it, so then ein chanami, you've created the new chefza of iser, and then in such a case you would say yesh bishul achar bishul. Okay. How many Talmidim would like to stop here, and how many we could go on? I'm very much into not overloading. So how many would prefer, by a show of hands, I do this quite often, how many people would prefer to stop here and how many people would prefer to go on? To stop here? To go on? Okay, let's plow ahead. So now let's continue in terms of the Geder Bishul. So in regards to the Geder of Bishul itself, so here there is a very important Rambam. The Rambam writes the following. Let's take a look. I photocopied the Rambam, a fascinating Rambam, Perek Tes Halacha Beis, that in other words, what we are now going to do up until now, what we've been discussing is in our 9 nafkaminas, as the fact that the Torah aser basar b'chalav b'Torah's bishul and not b'loshen achila, we had 9 nafkaminas. We're now going to address the issue that not only did the Torah prohibit it b'loshen bishul, but the Torah was silent in saying achila. So the Rambam, of course, everybody's bothered, and what we're going to see is the approach of Parshanim as well as the halachic approach. The Rambam is bothered by this question. He talks about it in the Yad. Zok the Heilige Rambam, Perek Tes Halacha Beis, Lo shosak hakosov milesar achila, elo pnei she'asar bishul. Klomar vafilu bishul aser v'ein tzarich lomar achilaso. The Rambam says that when it comes to incest, the Torah never says that incest with one's daughter is asr. The Torah says it's asr with one's granddaughter. So Chazal knew as a Davar Pashat that's a kal v'chomer. That certainly with one's daughter it's going to be asr. The Rambam equates that sugya in Yavamis to our sugya. And the Rambam says that the reason why the Torah didn't prohibit the Isser of Achila is because, if you will, it's a Kal V'chomer. That if Bishul is Asr, certainly Achila is going to be Asr. Now, there are 2 ways to interpret this Rambam. One way of interpreting the Rambam is the Rambam saying that this is a Svaras Hakra, it's a Kal V'chomer Hakra. That the Torah is just giving us is a Kal V'chomer. The Kesef Mishnah in Hilchos Avas Hatuma, interestingly, not over here in Hilchos Machalos Asuras, but in Hilchos Avas Hatuma, he understands the Rambam even in a more mechudishtik way. Rav Yosef Engel, if I'm not mistaken, has an essay about this in general, and that is, we are familiar, actually, in Basar V'chalav is the best example of a siyag midrabanan. That midrabanan, they protected, they built a fence. The Mishnah Avos talks about it. They built a fence to protect the Isurei D'Oraisa and created Isurei D'Rabban. What's the great example of Basar B'chalav? Basar of B'chalav. Every once in a while, you talking to a high schooler and they're stunned to hear that chicken and milk, according to the Torah, is mutter. Chazal can, well, by the way, it's a machlokes tanoim. But we paskin that, and we're going to discuss, halacha l'maisa, actually, it's interesting. Rav Neven Sal Shlita at times is koshesh for the tanoim as a chumrah that Basar of B'chalav is doraisa. But at the end, and we will get there, we will see the machlokas Tanaim Mirza Hashem. But bottom line is, it's clear, and the Rambam is very sharp about it, that we pass in Basar Ba'of B'chalav is only midrabanan. So that's a classic siyag. That Chazal, according to those Tanaim that we pass in, Chazal prohibited chicken and milk as a fence around Basar B'chalav. It's not a cheftza in the language of the Meshech Chachma. Basar of B'chalav is not a cheftza of machalos asuras, but rather it's an iser gavra. It's just an iser gavra. The terminology is going to be important for us later on. Tov, that's the din of Basar of B'chalav. How do you look at Bishul? Comes along the Kesef Mishnah, he seems to say that Bishul is a siyag for Achila. It's called a siyag doraisa. That's where Rabbi Yosef Engel collects Shita, different examples in Shas, where even though it's an Isser D'Oraisa, the Isser D'Oraisa is a siyag for another. One example that sometimes Mefarshim will use is when it comes to the Isser Bal Yirah as being a siyag for Isser Achila, etc. There are a few examples of that. So the Kesef Mishnah understands that it's not only that's just stamakal, it's not a stamakal v'chomer, but really it tells us that the Isser Bishul is going to be siyag. According to this, so then the Torah, when it omits the word achila, so there what's happening when the Torah omits it? The Torah is omitting it because the Torah wants to emphasize that this siyag is going to be aser, but kal v'chomer achila is going to be aser as well. There is another way of understanding this puzzling phenomenon of why the Torah did not discuss Isser Achila. So now we're moving, and we're going to come back to how this relates to Geder Bishul shortly. There is another way of understanding this interesting phenomenon that the Torah didn't tell us in Isser Achila at all. So what's the halachic answer to why? Let me be clear. What's the halachic answer, the basic halachic answer why the Torah didn't tell us? Because to tell us that derech bishul defines achila and hana. You won't have a chefza basar b'chalav that's asar b'achila b'hana if it's not derech bishul. That's how we started off with today. Comes along the Ksav HaKabbalah. My father, Olav Shalom, was very fond of Sefer Ksav HaKabbalah. It's a brilliant, brilliant Sefer, one of the Gedolei Torah from Frankfurt of the middle 19th century. The Ksav HaKabbalah did an amazing thing. What he did is he took all of the, not all, but many drashos of Chazal that seem to be obscure in the sense of Pshuto Shel Mikra, and shows how it fits into Pashut Pshat in the Pasuk. Up until now, we have not explained in Pshuto Shel Mikra Chazal's understanding of Echad Isra Achil, Echad Isra Hana. Where do you see it? So one approach is the Rambam's approach, and that is that it's a Kal V'chomer, that you see it in the Kal V'chomer. And the halachic way that that's formulated by the Kesef Mishnah is that's a siyag. The Ksav HaKabbalah has another interesting approach. Take a look at the Ksav HaKabbalah. I photocopied it for you. I'm indebted to Shmuel Dratch, who was sitting in your seats about 5 years ago. When we discussed this, of course, when we started the first year in Basar B'chalav, and he called my attention to this Ksav HaKabbalah. Ksav HaKabbalah in Mishpatim, Perek Chav Gimel Pasuk Yutes, on Lo Sevashel, it's about halfway through the booklet, he points out that the word bishul has 3 meanings in the Torah. For example, there's a big kasha when it comes to Karban Pesach, that at times in Divrei Hayom it says Vayivashlu es HaPasach, and we know that you're not allowed to cook the Karban Pesach. So the answer is that bishul doesn't always mean literally to cook, it could also mean to roast as well. Okay? So that's one unique meaning of bishul. The most classic meaning of bishul is to cook. But he points out that there's a third meaning of bishul, and that's most relevant for us right now. And he's mechadesh, that he thinks that that's what bishul here, lo sevashel, doesn't mean to cook, but lo sevashel, bishul means ripe. For example, in Yoel, the pasuk says that the harvest was mivushal, and then there was a terrible plague. In other words, the word bashul, like hivshilu eshkeloseh or bishel hakatzir, means that the food was ripe. The food was ripe. In other words, says the Ksav HaKabbalah, lo sevashel means to prepare for consumption. Bashel means that it's ready for human consumption. And in those words, you have both, or not only both, all 3 connotations of Chazal. Prepare and to consume. When something is ripe, it's ready for achila and it's ready for hana. Lo sevashel means don't go through the process of ripening and benefiting from the basar b'chalav. So that's a fascinating approach by the Ksav HaKabbalah. The truth is, if this was where the sugya stopped, then maybe I would discuss it with you in Seder, because we're learning lahalacha, and we're not learning parshanut. But this does have a fascinating halacha l'maisa application, where the laboratory in Yeshiva University in the 1930s, and a chocolate middleman in Meir Sha'arim asked the same but very, very different shaila to 2 Gedolei Torah at the time, and both of them, one in Meir Sha'arim and the other in Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, said the same massive chiddush, a massive chiddush that's based on this discussion in the Rambam and so on. What am I referring to? So Rav Shechter Shlita quotes in the Sefer, I think it's in the first volume, in Nefesh Harav. I have it photocopied over here. I don't always remember all the names of the Sefer, of which Sefer is what. In Pnei Harav. In Pnei Harav, page Kuf Nun Beis, under Basar B'chalav, Shechter has the following question that was asked to Rav Moshe Soloveitchik. Zatzal. Moshe Soloveitchik passed away in 1941. So that, the picture right outside, is a couple years after from the Smicha class. It's the picture of the Smicha class with Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik Zatzal. So that picture says it's 1943, 1944. When I think about that time, it's very, very chilling to think that they were sitting in that picture, posing for a picture when millions of Jews at that moment were being killed in Europe. It's really, so prior to that, we're talking about in the 30s. So Moshe Soloveitchik was asked the following shayla. He was asked by the boys who were going to college, asked him that they noticed that one of their assignments in the laboratory was to heat up and test derivatives of both basar and chalav. A Jew can't be a chef in a non-kosher restaurant that's going to be cooking basar v'chalav. So the shaila was, what's the heter for them to be cooking both basar v'chalav? So Rav Moshe Soloveitchik answered that they can't cut it out of chem lab. It's not an excuse to leave chemistry lab. Why? L'chura it's bishul basar v'chalav. So he took this Kesef Mishnah so literally. He understood that the only time you're over in Issa Bishul Basar V'chalav is if you're truly preparing for Achila. If it's obvious and it's clear that you're not preparing for Achila, then it's going to be mutter. Wow, you need big shoulders. In other words, that's to understand the Rambam, not just that Stama Kal V'chomer, but the Rambam is learning like the Kesef Mishnah that's a siyag. So the siyag does not apply if it's vivadai, you're not going to come lidei achila. The same shaila, in a totally different shaila, there's an expression in Hebrew. Oto geveret b'tzura acheret. The same lady dressed up differently. That's the expression in modern Hebrew. So the same shaila was addressed to the Chibina Rav. Chibina Rav was a great Gaon who survived the war in Europe. He came to Eretz Yisrael. He was one of the great Chasidish Marbitzei Torah. He was a Gaon Atzim, one of the great Polish Gaonim. He was mechutim with Rav Nachum Zemba Zecher Tzaddik Kol Shivracha, who was killed al Kiddush Hashem in Poland, and his children were also killed. But the Chibina Rav came to Eretz Yisrael. He has a Shilas Yeshuvas called Doivev Meisharim. If you want the exact Mar Makom, I have it over here, I think, in the Mar Makomos. Oh, wow. It's not here. Okay, but I'll get it to you, Bli Neder. That's funny, I didn't put it here. But in the Shaus HaTshuvas Dovei Misharim, it's in the Ateres Tzvi article. The Chibina Rav was asked the following shaila. He was asked the shaila by someone who was a middleman, or somewhere in the process of manufacturing fancy chocolate milk, which had been made in Europe and was delivered to Mea Sharim. And someone got wind of the fact that this fancy chocolate milk might actually contain animal derivatives inside the milk, inside the chocolate, which is mamish basar b'chalav. And there was a way to solve the shaila. They couldn't find out by asking the company. The company they were afraid was going to lie. But by then they had already figured out a chemical test that they'd be able to put in markers inside of the milk, and you would heat up the chocolate, and the chocolate then, based on the markers, there would be a marker that would show if there's any animal derivative inside. And the Dovev Meisharim is matir for the exact same reason that Rav Moshe Soloveitchik Zatzal was matir. And that is, he says that the Isra Basar B'chalav is only when the bishul is there to bring to Achila, but if you're doing a chemical test, it's not going to come to Achila, and therefore it's going to be mutter. I think I'll have the Mar Makom here. Our present chief, our former chief rabbi, when I started saying Shur, he was our present chief rabbi, I found the Maramakom. Rav Yitzchak Yosef Shlita quotes in the Yalkut Yosef, the Dov Misharm. Dov Misharm is Siman Lamed. And this is in the Yalkut Yosef of Basar B'Chalev's page Kuf Pei. So now we fill in where the Dov Misharm is. He quotes a Machlokas HaPoskim on the Shaila, and the Dov Misharm was Mekel. Interestingly, the other Rav in Yerushalayim, the great Litvischer Rav in Yerushalayim at the time, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, was Machmir. So it was a debate in Meir Sharm, but it was the same thing that they were discussing in our yeshiva, before our yeshiva was in Eretz Yisrael, that they were discussing in our yeshiva in America. I myself find that it's a brilliant chiddush, and it's really definitely Mosef to our limud. It's basically being matir a potential Isser D'Oraisa on a fascinating chiddush of a Kesef Mishnah in Hilchos Avos HaToma that you really don't have a source for that anywhere else. And if you read the Rambam differently, then you don't, then the Kesef Mishnah, but the Kesef Mishnah is a great Kesef Mishnah. But I'm not aware of another source. If somebody has another source, then that will help me out. Yes?
I found the Pri Chadash.
Pri Chadash is Mefurish?
Yeah.
Please show me. Yeah, please show me.
It's in Pei Zion, Beis.
I don't have a Pri Chadash in the back of my...
He quotes the Targum who says, Lo Sevashen, Lo Seichlon.
Mm-hmm.
V'lai Savur de Bishul Sh'asar HaKasav, Hainu Davka K'She'achlo.
He says B'lashon Ulai. Does he paskin that way?
Use it as a term.
Wow. Okay, Yashar Koach. Thank you very, very much for pointing that out. In Aleph, V'ulai Savur. Right, he's just saying V'ulai Savur on the Targum Onkelos.
Yeah.
Ulai Savur on Targum Onkelos. Right. Okay. Yafet, but thank you for pointing out. It's definitely a great Maramakom. Yashar Koach. When I was in yeshiva, they didn't have the Pri Chadash in the back. Good. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's see, was there anything else that I wanted to... Yes, let me just apply one more question with Geder Bishul. Kenny, you wanted to weigh in with something, and then we'll wrap up.
What was the source of Rabbi talking about Chumash?
Oh, the Ksava Kabbalah.
Yeah, so I read it inside yesterday, but I don't fully remember it. But wasn't what that was what Rabbi was saying, was that the whole point of the Isser of it was that it's preparing for consumption.
So maybe you can even go, is this what you're driving at? Maybe according to Ksava Kabbalah it's also. But again, we don't paskin based on Parsha Note also. In other words, it's not in the classic sources. So what you're pointing out, please remind me your first name again, Jesselson. Elad. What Elad's pointing out is that there is somewhere in the Shulchan Aruch, it's a Pri Chadash B'das Targum Onkelos. It's not also, it's an ulai of the Pri Chadash B'das Targum Onkelos. I don't know if I'd be matir or Safek D'Oraisa based on that, but definitely it's a Masorah in our yeshiva. Rav Shechter Shlita felt it was worthy to put into Mipnei Harav. So it's definitely something to take seriously. I just don't have the shoulders to matter. I don't know if somebody would tell me to do it. If Rav Shechter told me to do it, of course, listen. But bli neder. But at the end of the day, it's a fascinating heter. Yes.
If it's like the Rambam is saying that it's kal v'chomer,
right?
That like from bishul to achila, then why does the Torah need to say it 3 times? If it just says bishul, then we know it's asur b'achila. Why do we need to say it 3 times?
The Achronim ask your kasha. That's I always felt that the Ksava Kabbalah, by the way, doesn't mention the Rambam by name. He mentions that and he says it's dachuk. I don't know. It's a little bit interesting, that the Ksava Kabbalah's pshat is very, very tantalizing. It's a very, very tantalizing pshat. One more application, Rabbosai, to this. In Hilchos Shabbos, there's a famous machlokas. It was famous after we learned it last year together, between Ramesha Feinstein in Chela Gimel Siman Nun Beis and the Mincha Shleima, Reb Shlomo Zalman in Siman Yud Beis Ha'ara number 4, whether to be chayiv bishul min haTorah do you need eish. This revolves around the sugya of Mevashel B'chama. Rashi writes in Perakira that the Gemara tells us that someone who cooks in the sun is not going to be chayiv. Rashi says because it's not the derech to be Mevashel in the sun. So Moshe Feinstein says the mashmos is that if it would be a derech to be cook in the sun in Shabbos, you would be chayiv. That's how Ramesha deduces, and therefore Ramesha says there's this brand new invention out there. Microwave, Rav Moshe writes, that there are a few wealthy people that have this thing called a microwave. And he said, so Rav Moshe called it out that it was going to become the derech to cook. So Rav Moshe says that he thinks to cook with it is going to be doraisa. Rav Shlomo Zalman Zatzal in Mincha Shlomo seems to disagree, and Rav Shlomo Zalman quotes a Eglei Tal who says that you need some type of medium that resembles fire. If you don't have fire, it's not going to be bishul doraisa. So we brought this up last year in cases of when it's let's say just as easy to cook in a case of pikuach nefesh, etc. Is there any advantage of cooking in a microwave? According to Rav Shlomo Zalman, there would be. According to Rav Moshe Lechura, there is no difference between the two. That's the machlokes between them. So Moreno Rav Miller Shlita, in his shiurim, when he discussed this, not in Hilchos Shabbos, but he discussed over here in Hilchos Basar B'chalav, he brought up that shaila and he said the following. He said, in his humble opinion, that's how Rav Miller says it, in my humble opinion. So Rav Miller said, in my humble opinion, that he thinks that even Rav Shlomo Zalman would agree that when it comes to basar b'chalav, if you cooked with a microwave, then you'd be chayiv. Because what was the svara that we said up until now? That what's the isser of bishul basar b'chalav is to create the new conglomerate of basar b'chalav. So the question is whether through heat you've created tam basar b'chalav. So he says, when it comes to Shabbos, then there's a certain prescribed way to do it. When it comes to basar b'chalav, Rav Miller felt, and shortly I'll record a different opinion, but Rav Miller felt that at the end of the day, that he thinks that Rav Shlomo Zalman would agree that when it comes to basar b'chalav, it's going to be an issur daraisa. The Iglei Tal's rayas are that the definition of bishul in its formal sense is through fire. But if the whole issur of basar b'chalav, as we said, like in the case, remember we were mechadesh, that if you have basar that's cooked and chalav that's cooked, that even though in Hilchos Shabbos cooking it together is not going to be considered Nisr for Shabbos, but when it comes to basar b'chalav, it's creating through heat tam. So Miller thought so that even when it comes to a microwave, even you're at the end of the day through heat you're creating tam. So then in such a case he thought even Rav Shlomo Zalman would agree. Interestingly, when I told it to Mori V'Rabbi Rav Nevensal Shlita, he disagreed. He disagreed about what his Rebbe's kavana was, and so it's a fascinating machlokus between Rav Miller and Rav Nevensal Sheyichyu that about what would Rav Shlomo Zalman say about the microwave cooking. That Rav Miller argued that based on the lumdus that we had above, that one would be chayiv. Even Rav Shlomo Zalman would agree. While Rav Nevensal said no. The definition of bishul of Rav Shlomo Zalman will be a definition not only for Shabbos, but will apply also for basar b'chalav. Okay, so we didn't do a lot inside. Mirza Hashem, next year we're going to start plowing through Simin Pei Zayin. We were zoche to do 9 nafkaminas. The 9th nafkamina was really, we discussed the geder of bishul, and discussing the geder of bishul, we discussed ein bishul achar bishul, and the relationship between the Isser Bishul and the Isser Achila, that's mafurish, that we start out with, that without having Bishul, you're not going to have a definition of Basar B'chal, the Ochal of Basar B'chal, but does it go in the other direction as well? Do you say that the only time you're going to have an Isser Bishul is if you're creating an Ochal of Basar B'chal? And that was the big Chiddush based on the Kesef Mishnah, and then the question of whether we apply all of the rules of Bishul and Hilchos Shabbos to basar b'chalav. Just a couple of points in Mirza Hashem are learning together. I'm really excited to be learning with you. Some points about the limud. First of all, about and remind me also to talk a little bit about the svarim that I alluded to before, about the outline. So I use the word outline specifically. If you are learning and you're thriving in basar b'chalav taruvos up until around Purim time, then we'll go on to Agalos Kalim. That's a lot of material. I have to talk about that as well. Don't worry about the outlines. As long as you're coming to Shir and you're following Shir, and you're going to have to do Chazara for the Bechina, so then that's great. You don't have to learn like me. You shouldn't think like me, in the sense that different minds and different approaches are helpful. Obviously, for the Bechina, you're going to want to know what I said. But don't feel in terms of your own limud constrained at all by it. What this is you get a sense of what we're doing, what we're going to be doing in Shir, and what to focus on, and also in terms of pacing yourself. Because at the end of the day, that brings me to the point of the amount of material. There's a lot of material in Basar B'chalav and Taruvas, and we move. I go faster than I want to go, just because we have a tremendous amount to do. And it's become a little bit more challenging in terms of our curriculum. Once upon a time, Basar B'chalav Taruvas was the whole year. Rav Miller Shlita, by the way, used to start with Taruvas, and he used to do Lomdos and Taruvas for about a month and a half. Just like, Sugyas with Reb Chaim's, etc., etc. For a couple of reasons, I decided not to do it. Rav Ben-Nar Shlita also now starts with Basar B'chalav as well, and we jump in quickly because we don't have that quote-unquote luxury to spend all that time doing that. So pacing yourself is important. Just a calendaric note. Generally, we have, unlike in Shabbos, we have 4 bechinas for Isser V'Heter, 2 on Basar B'chalav, 1 on Taruvos, and that is going to be around, the 1 on Taruvos is going to be around Purim time. Around Purim time, a little bit after, we then go, and this is Gishmak, we go to Hagalas Kelim right before Pesach, and that works out well because the main source of Hagalas Kelim is actually in Hilchos Pesach. So before Hilchos Pesach, that will be very Gishmak. We will be doing Hagalas Kelim for Shari Surim as well as for Hilchos Pesach, and we'll do Tur Beis Yosef and Mishnah Berurah. We're not going to do as much Magen Avraham and Taz. We'll actually learn it through the Mishnah Berurah. That will be through a little bit after Pesach, and then we go on to Tfilas Kelim. There's something else I'm missing. Tfilas Kelim and Bishul Akum. So there's a lot to do in the year. So daven for Siyata D'Shmaya that Mirz Hashem we should get it all done. Keep in mind that we do have to cover ground. Rav Miller says very, very beautifully that the goal is that you should feel comfortable, not necessarily master it. At the pace that we're going on is to feel comfortable with the material, to be familiar with the material, to be able to know to ask a shaila, and then in Mirz Hashem to know really how to take apart a shaila. And in Mirz Hashem that you're setting yourselves up. Then Mirz Hashem you learn it another couple of times, then you'll really be able to paskin a shaila at the tip of your fingers. It takes a few times to go through Basar B'chalav and Taruvos to be able to really feel comfortable. But that's the reality in terms of the pace that we're learning at. I wish that we could do it in 2 years, but Baruch Hashem. But it's a productive limud and it's a geshmak limud, but it's a little intense. So I'm warning you that it's going to be a little bit intense, and there are parts that get difficult. There are shachs and tazes that are difficult. What else is important for me to tell you? Of course, feel free to come over and speak and learning. I love speaking and learning with the Talmidim, and come over to feel comfortable to discuss anything. It's a schus to be able to grow together. In terms of the Svarim, so I mentioned some of the Svarim in the orientation, and I would add that I found helpful, something I forgot to mention to you, is HaKadosh Baruch Hu made it for our generation. There are some times that I get stuck in the shachs and tazes, and when I was your age, we didn't have this. But nowadays, I don't know if I'd be able to get through some shachs and tazes without, there is basically cliff notes on the shach and taz. There was already cliff notes 30 years ago, but the newer cliff notes are much better, and that is the Oz V'Hadar, Mesifta, has a volume on Basar B'chalav. I didn't tell you up until now about it because I don't want you that to be your primary, but it basically is a Mesifta. It has the basic sugyas, halacha l'maisa in the back, like the Mesifta in the back, and most significantly is they have a running commentary on the Shach and Taz. In other words, they explain every line in the Shach and Taz. So if you're stuck, which is normal, so you could look up over there. I would not encourage that to be your primary sefer, but just to know, as things get difficult, definitely to use that. The classic sefer is, of course, the Badei HaShulchan, which is absolutely fantastic. It's very long. He attempted to do what the Mishnah Berurah did in Arach Chaim, but in terms of the length, he wasn't successful. It's still a fantastic, fantastic sefer. But if you want to get good background, if you want to see, I learned the Shulchan Aruch and the Shach and the Taz, and I want a good summary and see what the basic shittas of the poskim are, so then the Badei Shulchan is fantastic. And of course, if you want to sort of put it into your own vernacular, so once you finish a sugya, to read over Rabbi Forst's kashrus with the footnotes, that's fantastic as well. Looking forward to Mirza Hashem steiging together. Bezrat Hashem.